Good morning, and welcome to the 14th in our Shift, Sustain, and Succeed series. We welcome anyone to join us every Tuesday. Well, I was going to say Tuesday and Thursday, but we're now going to our kind of summer schedule where we'll be meeting just every Tuesday from 9 to 9:30 as we do our best to help find answers to the most pressing questions that our businesses have in navigating our current situation, which still is COVID-19. No one has been left untouched by the COVID virus. Over the last 7 weeks, we have largely focused the attention of Shift, Sustain, Succeed series on business issues and concerns. But as our members and partner nonprofits well know, those of us who carry 501c3, C6, or any other nonprofit tax status have been met with most of the same challenges. Nonprofits are as diverse as business classifications, and while facing unique challenges, local nonprofits have continued to be collaborative in meeting the needs of the community. Today, we will discuss some of the universal challenges and opportunities faced not now and during any crisis, and why this should matter to our business community. I've invited Trenton Moulin, who is the president of Bridge Builders Community Foundations, to join us today for our Q&A. Trenton works with many or most, maybe all nonprofits in our region, and works with our business community to make sure that we're meeting the challenges that they're experiencing at this time. I'll remind everyone that we are in an ever-changing situation where what we think is fact today may be replaced by new information tomorrow. Everything shared today is based on the best information we have available. Now, if you have any additional questions, please submit them in the Zoom chat, and we'll do our best to include those towards the end of the meeting, or we'll follow up with you. So Trenton, kind of as a baseline, let's talk about what and who are nonprofits. How are they different than business? What makes an organization a nonprofit? And kind of what is the scope of that?
Well, nonprofits are designated by the IRS and the Pennsylvania Bureau of Charitable Organizations. That's the boring side, and they receive tax exemption for the purpose, as stated in the tax code, for easing the burden on government. And there's different ways that nonprofits can do that. And that's through human services, that's through giving back to the community in arts related, that's for the general community benefit, economic development, libraries, but those are designated by the IRS. And you have to go through both at the federal and the state level. And there's different types of 501c, as you said, 501c3s, which are charitable organizations, 501c6s, which are chambers and other type of membership organizations. That we can go down through the whole litany, but really there's a whole broad spectrum of nonprofits. Today, just because of where I gravitate towards, we're going to be probably focusing on the 501c3s, and I just know those better, so.
Great. And for full disclosure, the Venango Chamber is a nonprofit as a 501c6. So we are a membership-based organization. Our tax status allows us to do advocacy activities that are not permissible as a 501c3. So we have some things we're allowed to do that a 501c3 isn't, but we also don't get some of the benefits of the charitable status. So I'm happy to follow up with anyone that has further questions about that. So nonprofits as businesses, because Trenton, you and I both know that we should be running our organizations as businesses, we were forced to deal with many of the same immediate issues that businesses were in early March. We have employees, so we were looking at safety issues, unemployment issues, funding issues. When we look back through the last 8 weeks of our Shift Sustain series, many of the things applied to nonprofits. Can you talk about some of those issues and how those were faced by our nonprofit community?
Yeah, and as you said that nonprofits are businesses, I looked up some statistics last night, and in Pennsylvania, 15.7% of private employment are nonprofit private employers. So 15% of the workforce in Pennsylvania in the private sector is nonprofit employees. That's bigger than I thought it would be. And that's non-governmental, but that's all private sector. And it also, in the United States, nonprofits make up 5.4% of the total GDP, which, I mean, we have a large GDP, and that's big. So, and as businesses, How do we face this? How did we face this? And how are we facing it? I'll tell you what, it was a very fluid situation early on. There were a lot of changes for us at the community foundation, but there's also we hosted a few phone calls, or Zoom calls, I should say, just as a way for nonprofit leaders to interact. And it was a very fluid situation. First off, it was, do we stay open? You know, what are the rules there? How do we do this? And if we do stay open, how? And I know that many businesses were facing those same questions. There was a very sudden and a need for a crisis plan, and working with staff that way. There were many concerns early on the questions centering around employee and client safety. How do we keep our employees safe? How do we keep those that we serve safe? What do our funders say? Nonprofits have a very broad spectrum of different funding sources, whether that be local government, state government, federal government, combination of the two, grants, donors. You know, there's a very broad spectrum. So what are those funders saying? After those initial questions, it evolved into, should we participate in the PPP or the EIDL and all the other programs that were being rolled out to help keep people on payroll and receiving money, that type of thing. And then also, and how do we do that? Who do we go through? You know, there were all these questions, you know, centering around that. And then it evolved into, how do we replace the funding that we would have received from fundraisers? It was during Lent. There were fish fries. There were many other activities that were planned that many nonprofits depend on, that they were no longer able to have. So how do we have the fundraiser if we do, or how do we replace that funding? Another big issue that a lot of nonprofits were working on was to implement technology and implement it effectively. A lot of nonprofits that provide therapy services were concerned about HIPAA and non-secured lines, and there was a HIPAA waiver for therapy and that type of thing, for use for Zoom, that type of thing. There was, I know that local elder care facilities, they were scrambling because they had to put things in place so that their clients that live with them could use an iPad or a tablet to video call back to their families. And that was an unforeseen expense, and also an unforeseen thing that they had to overcome so that they could, so that those clients could talk to their families. There was also telehealth. You know, people didn't want to go to the hospital, so hospitals were looking into ramping up their telehealth plans. I know one local hospital in the region, they really ramped up their telehealth so that they could have doctor visits and that type of thing, so people didn't have to come in. But that was a large expense, almost in the six figures. Also, there was childcare issues for employees. I was one of those. They closed the childcare centers, and they had to figure out, we had to, you know, me personally too, we had to figure out how are we going to balance childcare. And for many meetings, I would just put my 4-year-old son on my lap, because it was either that or he's going to be pulling on my chair. So, and it seemed
clearly, Trenton, nonprofits face the same things. I think one of well, there are a couple things that came to mind as you were talking there, and one kind of is addressed in the next question. Is some nonprofits were obviously essential. They were the front line that were called to help when people lost their jobs and needed fed. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I forgot to talk with you about the fact that most nonprofits, maybe all nonprofits, I don't know this, are board driven. So unlike a business where you might have a single owner or a very small group that make decisions, boards can have anywhere from, maybe 3 to 5 board members, but often as many as dozens of board members who then get to weigh in those decisions. So the ability often of nonprofits to be really nimble can be a little different than a business that makes a quick business decision. And I apologize that you and I didn't talk about that before, but would you agree that that would be a unique challenge, that's a little more common to nonprofits than it would be to a business, certainly a
Right.
small business?
Right, and having those defined roles between the staff, the board, and what decisions are made where, I think that had to shake out. For That's a professional term, shake out. But it really, okay, what is the staff responsible for? What is the board responsible for? That those were lines that had to be drawn and had to be figured out virtually, which is also a little bit more difficult. We're getting a lot better at it now that we're a couple months into this. But those roles really had to be defined. There was definitely some gray area, but I think nonprofits are better for it.
Yeah, if they weren't done, if it wasn't done before COVID, it certainly begs the need for it to be done now. And I know that you and I both have some good experience with that and would be helpful. Well, let's go on to the next question. That, some nonprofits were obviously essential. I would like to say all nonprofits were essential, but by the governor's standards, some immediately were told you can stay open, but more importantly, you should stay open and keep your people on the front lines, while others were trying to do their work. Organizations like mine and yours had more flexibility to work work remotely, but there was a lot of pressure put on those nonprofits that were essential and serving frontline. Can you talk a little bit about, I know we met on some weekly calls with them and some of the challenges they had.
Yeah, there's a very broad spectrum of nonprofits. You have everything from frontline people giving food away, and then you have arts related on the, and I'm not saying, I'm not putting value statements on any of those. They're just 501c3s are a very diverse group, and whenever this hit, some were deemed essential immediately. Some were kind of in the middle. There were other human service agencies that some programs stayed open and some didn't. So some people were laid off, some people were kept on. There was kind of like a checkerboard, so to speak. There were many different questions centered around, okay, we do serve food, we're a food pantry, but we can't have people come into the shop. We got to create our food pantry into a drive-through now. Okay, well, if we're going to do a drive-through, it's no longer family service, so we need the containers for the food and the bags and the silverware and the all that kind of stuff. So there was a therapy nonprofit. They went completely telehealth. How do we do that? There were many questions somewhere in the gray areas. About specific programs or what do we do with this program? We received this grant money for this program and we can't do that now. What do we do with it?
That, another thing that we didn't get in the weeds when we were preparing, but much of the funding that revolves around the nonprofits is different than, a business deciding to just, so we have dollars now, we can decide where to spend it. Lots of strings attached to the funding that nonprofits get, particularly if it's federal or state funding. Right. Our schools are essentially, while they're government nonprofit, they're really having to look at how that all works. Well, we definitely heard about some really, encouraging stories of people working together. One for me was just simply that I was invited to sit down with nonprofits weekly and talk about what everyone was experiencing. But were there some things that you observed that were really good models for how nonprofits quickly pivoted and, reacted and continued to deliver their services, during the, midst of the crisis?
Yeah, I got to see the local food banks really be nimble. I was really encouraged by that. They created drive-throughs. They created lines and queues, and their use of social media, and really just kind of ramping up those virtual type offerings. The libraries went to a virtual story time. We definitely participated in that. We saw teachers really being creative in what they were doing with their curriculum and for enrichment and that type of thing. We saw, I was kind of scrambling at the beginning, I'll be honest, at the community foundation. What do we do? And hosting that weekly nonprofit call really, I think allowed for conversations to be had during the call, but also I know that there were other sidebars that came out of that I think were very beneficial as far as policy generation and hey, what are you doing for this? And it was great to see these nonprofits, come together and collaborate and vent sometimes, which we all needed because it was and it still is a nutty time. So
yeah, I would agree. The connectedness, the collaboration was great. And I think particularly in rural communities, there's often a sense that somehow we can't keep up or don't keep up. So watching everyone come together and really take care of the community. I know in those early calls, it was really comforting to hear some of the people that were involved in the food pantries. Mary Jean said, listen, we've got this. Really encouraging. When we said, what can we do to help you? She's like, stick with me. It's going to be a long ride, but we got this. And that, man, that really, I think, made us all feel much, much better. Well, what do you think were some of the most challenging things? If you could think of one or two things that as we come out of this and say, how do we prepare for the next crisis, nonprofits have got to...
Well, I would say figure out a leadership and management, a staff plan that does not involve those incidental hallway visits. It's going to be, it has to be intentional. It has to be how are we going to do this, that crisis management plan, whether that's a small disaster or a global pandemic. There were definitely some challenges centered around PPE and what the regs and stuff were like that. Technology, being able to be nimble and virtual for some of the staff and that type of thing. I think that learning curve has really spiked. I've seen a big increase on use of technology at least part of the time. Policy generation. There were so many policies that had to be generated in such a short time with the board input and doing everything virtually. I think those guidelines for the in-home care workers and all these, things flying around, I think it was, those were, if we could head that off at the pass, I think it would mitigate a lot of issues in the forward. And this was both for-profit and nonprofit, but understanding the rules and the regs coming down from the state and the feds. That's always, finding those experts that can comb through these tomes of law that were generated and then put those into digestible amounts and understandable amounts for us. I think that
particularly when they're changing so rapidly. I mean,
oh,
that's not over. We continue to do that.
Right. And just finding those resources and making those connections and that type of thing. So HR, liability concerns are all, that's for any business. How do we bring people in? How do we bring people in safely? How do they go into a client's home? How do they provide therapy and services while social distancing and with proper protection and that type of thing? So.
And I think that's where there's real power in collaboration. I hope that we'll continue to do weekly calls. I know I've had some conflicts more recently, but we have so much ability to learn from each other and maybe, if we need to bring in outside help to help with some of the, policy writing and things like that, collaboratively we can afford it or find funding for it. So funding, let's talk about. Go ahead.
And I've seen so much sharing, Susan. Nobody is proud of what they've generated or what they came up with, and they're like, "Here, I'll give you the whole Word document. Adopt and adapt this as needed." It's just so great to see even some nonprofits that would be perceived as competitors. Just here, take my policy. Here you go. It's just so heartening to see in this time.
So for those listening, if you are a nonprofit that says, well, we really could use that or could lend that, I think this is a great opportunity for us to even, continue forward, being more collaborative. Also, we may have people that are listening that don't work for a nonprofit, but you serve on a nonprofit board or would like to. It's a really good reminder that there's a lot that can be done working together. But let's talk a little bit about funding, because I think, they're as diverse as nonprofits are, funding is diverse too. And a lot of the funding for nonprofits has been impacted, whether it's because they're individual donors. Some are completely privately funded by individual donations or business sponsorships, fundraising. Others do have some money coming down the pike from, federal or state funding. What do you see the kind of future for that is? What should we be doing to keep our nonprofits, at least functioning, but ideally functioning healthy and be able to continue to meet their customer needs?
Well, I'm biased here on many levels, but I've seen that PPP was a huge one in the kind of the stopgap. That was a big help in keeping the doors open, keeping employees on the payroll.
And most nonprofits were eligible. We were not as a 501c6, but 501c3s were, and there's still money there, right? If someone hasn't applied for it yet, I believe it's still open.
You would know better than I believe so, but I don't want to mislead anybody, Susan. So yeah. I think you're correct, but a lot of, to be honest, a lot of nonprofits have lost a lot through the fundraisers, whether that be a 5K, a golf outing, fish fries. Those nonprofits rely on those funds that come in. A lot of them are really looking for other avenues right now. I've noticed that the county and the state and the federal funding, some have expanded because of the need is expanding, but also other state and federal funds, they're telling them to plan for cuts, in the coming budgets, and how that pans out. That depends on Harrisburg and DC and that type of thing. So God only knows what'll happen. So, but there's a very broad spectrum when it comes to that. There's a lot of question marks centered around that. Things are stable as far as, human service funding, but I could see that changing, because those were locked in, so to speak. But I think we're going to see a lot of changes, and who knows where that spotlight's going to shine in the priorities from the policymakers.
Yeah, would you agree that some of it, it's too soon to tell? So we could see that some of that, particularly that the funding that comes from state, county, federal, 6 months out could look very different than, we just don't know. But right. Private funding, I'd like to take just a minute and talk about that, because all of us on the call are just individuals who care about things. And I've watched there be some really, really powerful efforts in the nonprofit community, even benefiting the business community, from individuals who are just kind enough to make a donation from $5 to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I think it's important for we nonprofits to know, kind of, you don't ask, you don't get. So it's really, really important that we're communicating our needs really clearly. And when we let people know what we're doing, whether it's a replacement fundraiser or there's simply a need, that you may be surprised at how responsive individuals and even the businesses who have continued operating will be. But also that then we in turn as individuals, it's a really good time to think about what you're able to do in a give back mode. Have you seen some of that happening in a really good way, Trenton?
I have the opportunity to see that, firsthand on a daily basis. And, with the COVID fund that we partnered with the United Way with, there was an outpouring of support on so many levels there, and to help individuals in our area that have been impacted. And really, I've seen a lot of nonprofits really starting to tell their story, and just maybe not viewing it as asking for donations, but saying, hey, we really need your support. Would you consider a gift? And people are like, yes, we want to keep that infrastructure here. We want to, and that's my biggest concern. I think is going to be, how do we retain the nonprofit infrastructure going forward?
Yeah, well, that's a great lead in to my next comment, but I'm going to comment ahead of that. I was fortunate before I ever got involved in nonprofit work, when I was a volunteer and worked in the business community for a bank, to get involved in some volunteer work where it was clearly recognized that Venango County has an exceptional network nonprofits. So as I look even at those of you who are on the call, we have so many of you who do represent our nonprofit community. It looks like Will's there. You know, the United Way is a huge player in delivering services and keeping other nonprofits operational. But we really have some unique models for collaboration in Venango County that are almost unheard of, even nationwide. And I think most people would be surprised to hear that. We tend to hear on the street, why aren't people working together? Why is there duplication of services? But we really are doing it right in Venango County. There's a lot of good work being done. We also have the benefit of a legacy of philanthropists. So we have some money that people invested decades ago, a century ago, that continues to benefit us. So we really are very fortunate. That said, this is an unprecedented situation. So what do you think are some of the risks that exist for services to be cut, or even organizations to have to make the decision to close? What are those risks, and what might we do to mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nonprofits that don't have that working capital reserve. That they have one or two funding streams, and that's it. So that infrastructure is a concern of mine, not necessarily now, but probably in the next 3 months. When the PPP runs out, whenever other funding streams and those effects of the loss of the fundraisers that really sustain them, whenever those type of things are really going to kind of rear its head. So I think the most successful nonprofits are going to be those with diverse funding streams that have an infrastructure in place, that have a support net or a little bit of a strategic reserve that would be there for situations like this, whether it be a pandemic or an agency type crisis. I think that we're going to have to see some creative ways to approach how to sustain themselves, and that's the same as in regular business, in a for-profit business. So how do we be nimble? How do we maybe look at other services that the local state or feds might support to keep the doors open and that type of thing? There's going to have to be a lot of shifting.
Yeah, as I think about that, I think of all the opportunities that certainly you and I have, and other organizations that provide training, or try to work to provide resources. There are lots of opportunities. We just need to hear from the nonprofit community what is needed, so that whether it's, I think about crisis planning, maybe that's something we can schedule for the future, where we actually help our nonprofit community with having good, solid nonprofit or crisis plans with diversified funding streams. We did that. We talked about that for business, but maybe that looks a little bit different for nonprofit. So great opportunities for all of us. As we kind of come down to the last few minutes here, I'll remind everyone, if there's something that you didn't hear about, you'd like us to talk about, you can throw that up in the chat. Also, I'm going to change my screens real quick here, remind everybody that as we build resources, Trenton and I will talk. If there's anything we need to add out on as a follow-up to this call, you'll find it out on our website, along with registrations to future sessions, which we're planning right now, and recordings of each session. So if there's somebody that wasn't able to join us today, you can go ahead and share recordings so that people can watch these after the fact. So, we all are talking about what's going to stick after COVID. So for nonprofit organizations, do you see some opportunities for some nonprofits to actually get through this and a year out be stronger than they were in February and March?
I see a heck of a lot more fluency with technology.
Yeah.
And that was kind of forced down our throats. I see some that have a more trust in their staff, that they've kicked them out of the nest, so to speak. They're working from home, that type of thing. Also, I think that there's a lot of nonprofits that are becoming a little bit more adept at understanding the risks and being nimble to face those. And whether that's as a staff, or as a staff and a board, or as a volunteer board, how do we deal, what are our options there? And how do we keep this service delivery? There's a lot of volunteer-led organizations They have no paid staff, and they're still trying to, they're figuring out a way to help people that have been impacted or just keep up their mission and ramp it up and ramp it up safely. It's just very encouraging to see that.
Yeah. Well, but just one quick little example. I just happened to talk to the Humane Society yesterday, and they are adopting out pets like crazy. So if there's a bright spot, it's we're doing a very, we know we're doing a good job of taking care of our people, but every nonprofit, regardless of how and who you serve, is important. And we're about at time, so we're not going to dig too deep into this, but Trenton, my very last item was, talking about our mission, our values, and our vision. And I think that it is so clear now that if we don't know as nonprofits what our mission and values are, we may have been a little scattered in the last few months. If you were trying to figure out, what do I do when I can't see people, or when I can't do what I've always done, there's where you need to revisit is, so what did we ever start this for? Any comments on that before we end?
Well, this is something near and dear to my heart, you know that, and but you could see those that had a clear role of mission and stayed true to their values. They had a better way of facing this crisis, and then devising a vision for how they were going to not only deal with this as an organization, but also how they were going to make our community a better place. And that, to me, if you have that sense of mission and you have those values to rest your laurels on, the rest kind of falls into place. And if you didn't have those, or if those were in kind of process, those would open up the cracks, so to speak. And a lot of people, a lot of organizations, had those in place, which was very encouraging to see. And they were like, hey, we're here to feed people. And now we're going to feed people differently.
Yeah, but as long as we know that's what we do. Yeah.
Because that's their mission, and so that was really encouraging to see that. And hopefully, that there's a little respite at some point, so that these can, these tough conversations with staff and board on the nonprofit sector can help congeal that a little bit and form those for the nonprofits that didn't have all those set in place yet. So
yeah, I would agree. I think, if everyone could just do this for me at the end of the call, go pull, if you don't have it on your wall, go grab your mission, and hopefully you have values. They can be real guiding principles, and take a look at those and see how you met those over the last 3 months, and see how you can continue to. I have a heart for vision. If anyone wants to spend more time talking to me about vision, I think it's a great time to take a look at how we craft visions that include pandemics, that mean that we can continue to do what we do and have a bright future, even if it's interrupted by a crisis. And with nonprofits, probably specifically when it's interrupted by a crisis, because I feel like in nonprofits that's kind of where we're at more often than not. So thankfully they're usually mini crises, but it's how we live, right? It's the culture of nonprofit to be fixing other people's crises all the time. Well, Trent, thank you for joining me. I know we could talk for days about nonprofits, which is the world we live in and love, and appreciate so much. For those on the call that work for a nonprofit, thank you, because you are undoubtedly not paid enough. You are working longer hours than anyone knows. We know it's the nature of the work. And we know that, one of the things I wonder, why should businesses care? You should care because it's the nonprofits that really are the pulse of the community, that are taking care of those unspoken needs all the time, every day. So again, thank you for the work you do. The recording's out there, and I know, let me switch the slide one more time and give you Trenton's contact information. I think most of you know Trenton and know how to get a hold of him, but I know he is happy to, answer any questions or work with you, whether it's in the nonprofit you work for or one that you care for and serve on a board for. So thank you all. Enjoy this beautiful day. It's a great time to get outside and take a walk. So hopefully see you all on Tuesday.
thank you, Susan.
See you later. Bye-bye.